In the last video we looked at yada. This time we'll have a look at a related word, Todah. Todah is a noun, a word defining a thing. It occurs 32 times in the Old Testament, as opposed to Yada's score of 114. Reverend Strong gave it the number 8,426. Now, remember your French lessons where nouns could be girls or boys, and you had to remember whether it was a le or a la. It's the same with Hebrew. Nouns there can be masculine or feminine, and Todah is a feminine noun. Here it is in Hebrew. Right to left, the letters are tav, with a dot in it because it's at the beginning of a word. Vav with a dot makes it not a v sound, but an o as in orange. Dalet with a kames vav, just like in yada. And hey, like in yada and shachar. Together they spell Todah. Todah is actually related to yada. Let's see how. Remember, the last video we started with yod, the Hebrew word for hand. From this comes yada, variously translated as throw, confess, thank or praise. And from yada is derived the noun Todah. In modern Hebrew, Todah is the equivalent of thank you, or specifically Todah Rabba, which is thank you very much, or merci beaucoup in French, or muchas gracias in Spanish, or mille grazie in Italian. Every civilized society needs a polite thank you phrase, and that is what Todah is in modern Hebrew. Well, that's in modern Hebrew. What about in the Bible? To start with, Todah is not much different from yada. It can mean thanksgiving, praise or confession. But when we look at the different contexts, things get a lot more interesting. The first time we see Todah in the Bible is in Leviticus. And please stay with me, I promise not to make your eyes glaze over. Todah is mentioned 5 times in 4 verses, and it's all to do with animal sacrifice. Now, Leviticus chapter 7 starts with regulations for the guilt offering, all about atoning for sin, but Todah is not about sin or guilt. In verse 11 we get some important context. These are the regulations for the fellowship offering anyone may present to the Lord. Leviticus chapter 7 verse 11. Now that word translated as fellowship in the New International Versions. Other versions render peace. And the Hebrew behind the English is shalem, which in turn comes from a word that should be familiar to all viewers, shalom. And as we know, shalom isn't just about peace in the sense of an uneasy truce and not fighting. It's about a relationship. It's about you and God being cool, if you like. Now, for most of the other sacrifices, the animal would either be all burned on the altar or parts of it burned and the rest given to the priests. For a shalom offering, it's split 3 ways. Part is burned as a pleasing odour for God, part goes to the priest, and the rest goes back to the person who offered it as a family barbecue. Again, it's about relationship, the offerer's relationship with God, and that relationship shared with the whole family in a common meal. Now that's verse 11, which defines the set of shalem offerings. There's actually 2. Moving on to verse 12, if they offer it as an expression of thankfulness, then along with this thank offering they are to offer, and then it goes on to list all the bread and the other bits and pieces that make up the sacrifice. That's Leviticus 7 verse 12. Now the word rendered thankfulness and thank offering in pretty much all English translations, they all use the word thank here. That word is Todah. So here, a Todah is a type of shalem offering, a sacrifice you make to thank God for his relationship with you and your family, and to enjoy that as a meal together. And that's come through in modern Hebrew as something you say to a shopkeeper, thank you very much. Now, it goes on in verse 13 to describe the sacrifice in more detail. Along with the fellowship offering of thanksgiving, the shalem offering of Todah, they are to present an offering with thick loaves of bread made with yeast. And again, the word fellowship is shalem and thanksgiving is Todah. And on to verse 15, we hear it all has to be eaten the same day. The meat of their fellowship offering of thanksgiving, shalem, Todah, must be eaten on the day it is offered. They must leave none of it till morning. Again, fellowship is shalem and thanksgiving is Todah. And there's one more reference in Leviticus reminding us it has to be eaten the same day. When you sacrifice a thank offering to the Lord, sacrifice it in such a way that it will be accepted on your behalf. It must be eaten that same day. Leave none of it till morning. I am the Lord. and that's Leviticus chapter 22, verses 29 to 30. Again, thank is Todah, and that's all the Todahs that are in Leviticus. Now, if you remember, Todah is from Yada, which is from Yod, the hand, and you bring that sacrifice in your hand. Now let's look at the book of Joshua. Now, from the start of chapter 2 to the end of chapter 6, it's all about the conquest of Jericho. The rules of engagement dictated by God were very strict. Everything and everyone was to be destroyed. The only exceptions were Rahab and her family, who had helped the spies, and also anything made of silver, gold, bronze or iron was to go into the Lord's treasury. But if there's one recurring theme in the Old Testament, it's this. The Israelites were a bit sketchy when it came to doing what they were told. And in verse 1 of chapter 7 we read, "But the Israelites were unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. Achan, son of Carmi, the son of Zimri, the son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took some of them, so the Lord's anger burnt against Israel." Oh dear. Joshua confronts Achan about his sin. Then Joshua said to Achan, "My son, give glory to the Lord, the God of Israel, and honour him. Tell me what you've done. Do not hide it from me." Now that word translated honour in the NIV is Todah. In other translations it's rendered praise or confess, and yes, like Yada, Todah is a word that can be hard to translate it into a single English word. But back to that passage in Leviticus where Todah is a family barbecue eaten in the presence of God as an expression of a good and strong relationship with him. When Achan took those devoted things, he was dazzled by their beauty and stepped away from his relationship with God, causing the whole company to be distanced as well. So Joshua tells him to give up those things that broke the relationship before God abandons the whole lot of them. Achan Todahs, or confesses, or honours God, or praises God. In doing so, he gives up the things he's taken for himself. And it doesn't end well for him. He and his family and everything he owns is destroyed at the end of chapter 7. In Joshua, we saw how Todah was used in context of giving up something that has broken the relationship with God. And there's a similar usage in Ezra chapter 10 and verse 11. But let's rewind a bit for the full story. Ezra is the story of how the Israelites returned from captivity in Babylon and rebuilt Jerusalem. For 70 years they endured Babylonian captivity, steadfastly keeping the laws and customs of their ancestors and refusing to integrate into Babylonian culture despite the pressures. If you want to get a flavour of it, read the book of Daniel, but that's all over now. They've come home to rebuild Jerusalem. No more temptation from the pagan culture. It's plain sailing now. But in Ezra chapter 9 and verse 2, some of the leaders come to Ezra and tell him what's been going on with the people who come back. They have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons and have mingled the holy race with the peoples around them, and the leaders and officials have led the way in this unfaithfulness. It's Ezra chapter 9 and verse 2. Oh dear. And the rest of that chapter is a long prayer of sadness and shame by Ezra. And in chapter 10, the people come around him and see what the matter is. And verse 10 and 11 of that chapter we read, "Then Ezra the priest stood up and said to them, 'You have been unfaithful. You have married foreign women, adding to Israel's guilt. Now honour the Lord, the God of your ancestors, and do his will. Separate yourselves from the people around you and from your foreign wives.'" And that word honour in the NIV, yes, it's Todah. The NIV is actually out on its own with that translation. Most of the others have make confession to or similar. Remember, neither Yada nor Todah have been an easy fit with one English word. And the rest of chapter 10 lists the Israelites who had married foreign women, and the women were sent away, and one hopes they found refuge back with their families. But here's Todah being used the same as in the story of Achan in the book of Joshua. Some of God's people have taken something they shouldn't. For Achan, it was plunder from Jericho. For these Israelites, it was foreign wives. In both cases, the relationship with God has been broken, and to repair that relationship, whatever was taken must be given up. Well, what is a sacrifice of praise? It's an idea that comes up in sermons quite a lot. We generally understand a sacrifice of praise as disciplining yourself to praise God when you don't feel like it. And yes, there's a lot to this idea. God is worthy of praise whether we feel like it or not. In his mercy he's created us so we enjoy praising him, but we are subject to ups and downs in our lives and emotions, and sometimes we just don't feel like it. But however we feel, God is always worthy of praise. So in our day, perhaps Todah is the way we have to push through tiredness, through feeling flat, through feeling unenthusiastic and into worship. Well, sort of. In Joshua with Achan and in Ezra with the mixed marriages, we saw Todah used to mean giving up whatever is separating you from God, even if it's just feeling a bit flat or something more serious in your life that shouldn't be there. As the old saying goes, if you feel far from God, it's not him that's moved. But there is another strand to the sacrifice of praise. Now, we saw in Leviticus that an animal sacrifice could be a sacrifice of praise, literally a shalem offering of Todah. But as we go through the 12 Todahs in the Psalms, we'll see that the sacrifice is becoming not the animal, but thanksgiving praise itself. Now let's look at Psalm 50. In verses 8 to 13, God says, "Listen, my people, and I will speak. I will testify against you, Israel. I am God, your God. I bring no charges against you concerning your sacrifices or concerning your burnt offerings, which are ever before me. I have no need of a bull from your stall or of goats from your pens, for every animal of the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird in the mountains, and the insect in the field are mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world is mine and all that is in it. Do I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of goats?" But in verse 14, the next verse, we read, "Sacrifice thank offerings to God, fulfill your vows to the Most High." And thank offering here is Todah. Now, in the New International Version here, it's suggestive that a thank offering refers back to the animal sacrifice that we saw in Leviticus, but as ever, the NIV is an outlier. The New Living Translation has, "Make thankfulness your sacrifice to God and keep the vows you made to the Most High." And the King James Version has, "Offer unto God thanksgiving and pay thy vows unto the Most High." And pretty much every other English translation gives it the same emphasis. Thankfulness itself is the sacrifice, the Todah. There's no animal being killed and no barbecue. And the last verse in Psalm 50 carries on this theme. "But those who sacrifice thank offerings honour me, and to the blameless I will show my salvation." That's the New International Version. The King James says, "Whosoever offereth praise glorifieth me, and to him that ordereth his conversation aright will I show the salvation of God." Okay, let's have a few more Todahs from the Psalms. Psalm 26, verse 7, "Proclaiming aloud your praise and telling of all your wonderful deeds." And Psalm in the New King James, "That I may proclaim with the voice of thanksgiving and tell of all your wondrous works." Praise and thanksgiving in these verses are translated from, yes, Todah. And Psalm 95 and verse 2, "Let us come before him with thanksgiving and extol him with music and song." Or, "Let us come before his presence with thanksgiving. Let us shout joyfully to him with psalms." Now the English versions agree on thanksgiving, and the Hebrew word behind them is Todah. So in the Psalms, Todah becomes praise of God. And how is God to be praised? Well, in the words of the Psalms themselves. But how do we get here? Now, Todah started in Leviticus as a kind of animal sacrifice, offered freely to celebrate the offerer's relationship with God, and a barbecue with the family. In Joshua and in Ezra, we see it extended to mean giving up something that's broken that relationship with God. And in the Psalms, it becomes something called a sacrifice of praise or of thanksgiving, with no animals or other farm produce involved. So where does this change occur? Well, the answer is the Tabernacle of David. We looked at this in the second video, Halal, and again in the previous one, Yada. At that time, the Ark of the Covenant was in Jerusalem on Mount Zion, in the tent David had put up for it. There was just the Ark. There was no altar and no animal sacrifices that were mentioned. The rest of the tabernacle and its bits and pieces, the altar of burnt offerings, the altar of incense, the lampstand, all the rest of it, that was at a place called Gibeon, which is about 10 kilometers north of Jerusalem. According to the internet, you can drive from Jerusalem to Gibeon in 35 minutes. but it would have taken a lot longer in those days. In the Bible, the spotlight is firmly on Jerusalem, not Gibeon, but from a few references, as far as we know, the sacrificial system was still running to a certain extent in the tabernacle at Gibeon. Now, we also believe that most of the Psalms are written for use at the tabernacle of David, so of course they talk about the Todah sacrifices that took place there, the sacrifice of praise. We've come a long way from a shalem offering of Todah as an animal sacrifice and a family barbecue back in Leviticus. Todah has been through giving up something that has separated you from God and into the sacrifice of praise. Now, before we wind this up, let's see how Todah takes on yet another meaning, this time in the book of Nehemiah. Now, if you've done much Bible study, you'll know that Nehemiah is from around the same time frame as Ezra, hundreds of years after the tabernacle of David, hundreds of years since Solomon combined animal sacrifices and the sacrifice of praise in the temple. In that time, kings have come and gone, Jerusalem has been conquered and its people carried off into exile, but now some of them are coming back. They're rebuilding the walls, they're rebuilding the temple and restoring the praise of God. Now in Nehemiah chapter 12, the walls have been rebuilt and they're having a dedication ceremony. Why not? In verse 27 we read how they're getting the professionals in, the Levites, to do the celebration. At the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, the Levites were sought out from where they lived and were brought to Jerusalem to celebrate joyfully the dedication with songs of thanksgiving and with the music of cymbals, harps and lyres. Now in this passage, thanksgiving is translated from Todah, just as it was back in Leviticus. But 4 verses on, I, that is Nehemiah, had the leaders of Judah go up on top of the wall. I also assigned 2 large choirs to give thanks. One was to proceed on top of the wall to the right toward the dung gate. And it goes on to list all the dignitaries who went round with this first choir. Choirs, or choir to give thanks. The translators felt they had to specify what and why. It's here translated from just one Hebrew word, Todah. The King James Version tells us which words were interpolated by the translators by putting them in italics. Then I brought up the princes of Judah upon the wall, and appointed 2 great companies of them that gave thanks, whereof one went on the right hand upon the wall toward the dung gate. And here thanks is Todah, and the words in italic, companies of them that gave, denoting they are interpolation by the translators. Again, in verse 38, we have the second Todah for the second choir. The second choir proceeded in the opposite direction. I followed them up on top of the wall, together with half the people, past the Tower of the Ovens to the broad wall. And that's Nehemiah chapter 12:38. The King James has this. The other company of them that gave thanks went over against them, and I after them, and half the people upon the wall, and from beyond the tower of the furnaces even unto the broad wall. And finally, in verse 40, the 2 choirs that gave thanks then took their places in the house of God. So did I, together with half the officials. That's Nehemiah chapter 12, verse 40. And in the King James it said, so stood the 2 companies of them that gave thanks in the house of God, and I and the half of the rulers with me. So that's the last nuance of meaning for Todah in the Old Testament. It's gone from an animal sacrifice to rejoice in your relationship with God, through an act of sacrifice to do away with something in your life that's broken that relationship, through to a sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving in corporate worship, and now it's the people doing the thanksgiving and praise. And it's not hard to imagine how that final twist came about in Nehemiah's day. I mean, it would have taken organisation and rehearsal to get those 2 large choirs, or great companies of them that give thanks, together into one singing machine for the big day. Todah practice tonight, don't forget. We're in the Todah! And that's how language evolves. Well, what do they call the people who play music in your church? Is it the worship band, the worship team, the worship group? My preference has always been for the word band because it harks back to the music of the 18th and early 19th century English church, before we had organs and pianos all over the place and we had instrumentalists. But in Nehemiah's day, the choir was called the Todah, and if you're wondering what to call that group of musicians in your church, there's another possibility to throw into the mix, Todah. Now, in the Psalms, we saw how Todah goes from being an animal sacrifice to being a sacrifice of praise. And of course, this idea comes straight through to the New Testament. I'm sure you've been thinking of this verse all through this video. Through Jesus, therefore, let us continually offer to God a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of lips that openly profess his name. That's Hebrews chapter 13, verse 15. And the Greek word here for sacrifice is thusian, and praise is anisos. Now, our worship is a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of lips that openly profess his name. What are the takeaways from this? Firstly, some years ago I was speaking to a friend and I asked him what he thought the difference was between singing along with the worship band in a church service, or singing at a big conference, or singing along with a rock band in a secular concert, waving your phone in the air along with the rest of the crowd. He said as far as he was concerned there's no difference, it's all the same thing. And that rather shocked me, and I hope it shocks you a bit. When we go to a concert, we pay the band to entertain us. When we go to church, our songs are a sacrifice, something we offer to God. We don't do it for a feel-good experience, and it's not some kind of religious entertainment. It's something we give to God, and this is diametrically opposed to everything about the secular music industry. Now, this is something we need to be aware of, because everything about modern worship songs, the style, the instruments, the lights, the smoke machines if you've got them, the mic stands, the loudspeakers, the mixing desk, even the publishing and marketing, is the same as contemporary pop music. And contemporary pop music is all about an audience being entertained and an audience who worship the pop idol holding the microphone. When the worship leader becomes a pop idol, we have a problem. When the band puts performance over dedication to God, we have a problem. When the congregation becomes an audience, we have a problem. And when I say problem, I mean idolatry. And when I say idolatry, I mean something that separates us from God and maybe needs that Joshua and Ezra style of Todah to put right. Secondly, whatever we offer to God, our music, our voices, the skills and giftings, all these are the things he has first created, like the animal in that sacrifice in Leviticus. So as it says in 1 Chronicles chapter 9 and verse 14, and in many liturgical traditions in the words of the offertory, all things come from you, and of your own we have given you. That's 1 Chronicles chapter 29 and verse 14. Years ago I was in a small group worshipping with instruments, and I was playing my saxophone. One of the ladies in the group said to me, "You're just taking the gift God's given you and you're giving it back to him." And I thought, yes, that's what it's all about. Finally, maybe a challenge for you. A wholehearted Todah rejoices in and celebrates a shalem relationship with God, like those sacrifices in Leviticus. Is there anything in your life disrupting that shalem relationship? If so, it may require a turning away from whatever it is that separates us from God. In Joshua, Achan was stoned to death. In Ezra, those foreign marriages were ended. Is there something you need to turn away from so you can turn towards God? Next time we'll take a look at a relative of halal, tehillah, with a side order of tefillah. And if you're thinking of tequila, you're very naughty. Stop sniggering at the back. Anyway, see you then, and thanks for taking the time to watch this video.